Welcome. You've found your way to a quiet place, a corner of the night where we move more slowly and let the noise of the surface world fade. This channel is a shared vessel for calm journeys into the deep ocean, into hidden layers of our planet that most of us will never see, but can still imagine. Stories shaped by depth, pressure, time, and long stretches of silence. And if you'd like to return to this place again, a quiet like or subscription helps keep these slow journeys afloat. For now, make yourself comfortable, and let's begin our descent. In this episode, we're going to visit those forgotten places in imagination only, moving slowly and explaining gently without assuming you know anything about pressure or life support, or how a human body adapts to the deep. You don't need any prior knowledge to come with us, just a willingness to drift downward, to let the noise of the surface world recede, and to share in a quiet question: what does it mean to build a home on the seafloor? And then walk away. By the time we arrive beside those rusting walls, the water around us will feel very still. But the story inside them is not quite finished yet. Beneath the waves, a soft mystery takes shape. So, as we drift there beside those rusting walls, make yourself comfortable for a moment in that stillness, because this is where our soft mystery really takes shape. We're going to sit with a question that sounds simple at first, but grows stranger the longer we look at it. If we can keep astronauts alive for years in orbit, why did we abandon the idea of permanent homes on our own seafloor after only a few brief decades? We often picture the future as something that rises upward, towers of glass, stations circling high above the Earth, sleek spacecraft cutting through the dark. But in the 1960s, another future was taking shape, not in the sky, but beneath the waves. Naval planners, oceanographers, and dreamers like Jacques Cousteau spoke calmly about underwater villages, about families living in metal houses on the bottom, about turning the deep into a new kind of neighborhood. Imagine the world they were reaching for: CLAB in the United States, Conshelf in the Mediterranean, Tektite in a quiet Caribbean bay, cylindrical rooms and spherical chambers lowered down through the cold water, pressurized like tiny space stations, their windows looking out onto sand, rock, and slow-drifting fish instead of stars. Inside, aquanauts slept, took notes, fixed equipment, and listened to the steady hiss of life support that held back the weight of the sea. Now, picture what happens when we pull back to the present. Those same sites, and many like them, are no longer bustling experiments. They are unvisited prototypes, quietly corroding in the deep, their paint peeling, their metal thinning under constant pressure, their names rarely spoken outside old reports. Above them, ships pass, tourists swim, storms roll across the surface, and almost no one knows there are small abandoned rooms on the seafloor where people once tried to live. The contrast is almost disorienting. On the International Space Station, crews circle the Earth again and again, year after year, their habitat carefully maintained, upgraded, and celebrated. Yet far shallower beneath the ocean's surface, in a world only a few hundred meters down, we walked away. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with quiet decommissions, funding that simply moved elsewhere, doors sealed, cables cut, and the water slowly reclaiming each place. Part of the answer lies in the nature of that underwater world itself. This is an alien realm that begins astonishingly close to us, just past the last slanting rays of sunlight, where the water turns from blue to black, where pressure climbs to many times what we feel at the surface, and where each extra meter of depth makes every seal, every weld, every valve a potential point of failure. It is a place that looks still, but is constantly wearing our machines down. And part of it lies in our changing tools and priorities. As remotely operated vehicles and autonomous robots grew more capable, as cameras, sensors, and cables could go deeper without a human body attached, the logic shifted. Why keep fragile, expensive habitats alive under crushing pressure for months when a robot can stay in the cold dark for years and never need to breathe. But beneath all the engineering and budgets, there is a quieter story we need to follow. It is the story of human ambition meeting an ocean that does not rush, that does not negotiate, that simply waits until metal weakens and lights go out. The sea did not rage against these stations. It simply surrounded them, patient and unyielding, until we decided not to fight so hard to keep them there. Because somewhere down in that darkness is a record of what we hoped the deep might become. A second frontier, a mirror to space, another way to expand our world. To understand why those hopes dimmed, we need to trace how they began. So next, we'll follow me back to the era when underwater cities felt not only possible, but inevitable, and see how Cold War fears, scientific curiosity, and quiet competition first drove us to build homes on the seafloor at all. Where are you listening from? Surface comfort versus seafloor cold. So before we follow me any farther into that history, let's pause together for a moment and notice where you are. Are you listening from a bed with the blankets pulled up, from a couch in the soft blue light of evening, from a desk lit by a single lamp while you finish one more quiet task? Just take a second and make yourself comfortable wherever you happen to be on the surface of the earth. Listen, if you can, to the small sounds around you. Maybe a fan turning the air, a fridge humming in another room, distant traffic, or the simple stillness of a late hour when most of the world feels like it has already gone to sleep. Notice the temperature on your skin, the way the air moves easily in and out of your lungs, the gentle, almost invisible pressure of the room holding steady around you. It is all so ordinary that we rarely think about it. But it is also a kind of quiet miracle. Now picture what happens if we shift that same moment down, not by a few meters, but by tens of meters, sometimes more, into the deep, cold water beneath the waves, where those research stations once rested on the seafloor. Outside their walls, the water hovers just above freezing, a liquid darkness pressing in from every direction, with no sunlight, no sky, only the slow drift of particles and the occasional flicker of a passing creature. Inside, a thin shell of metal and glass is all that keeps a small human world alive. We often picture pressure as something abstract, just a number on a gauge, but under that much water, it becomes almost tangible. At 10 atmospheres, the habitat walls feel the weight of roughly 10 times the air that rests on your shoulders right now. In simple terms, it is like having the mass of several cars, stacked and invisible, leaning on every square inch of that structure, all the time, for days and weeks and years. The air inside has to match that pressure so that the people there can breathe, which means their bodies, their ears, even their sleep, are quietly shaped by the deep. Up here, you can shift your weight on the mattress, change position on the couch, slow your thoughts, and let your attention wander in and out. Down there, every small sound is sharper, the creak of a frame, the hiss of a valve, the constant low reminder that beyond a few centimeters of metal is a world that does not forgive leaks. Your warmth comes from blankets or a heater. Theirs comes from careful life support systems pushing back against the cold. If you'd like this kind of slow story to keep you company again, you're welcome to gently tap like or subscribe, or just remember that this little corner of the internet is here whenever you need a calm voice talking about hidden places. There is no rush, no pressure at all. Whether you do or you don't, we're going to keep drifting through these forgotten habitats together. You do not have to catch every detail or stay fully alert. You can let the narrative move past like a current under ice, knowing that when you surface again, the story will still be unfolding and the deep will still be waiting for us to visit it. From the safety of whatever room you're in right now, letting go of the surface, slipping into journey mode, so for now, just stay as you are. Or, if you like, make yourself comfortable in a slightly different way, as if you were settling into a bunk on a very quiet ship at night. Let your shoulders drop a little, let your jaw loosen, and let your attention become a bit softer at the edges, as though the room around you were dimming while the story stays gently lit. If you can, slow your thoughts and notice your breathing, not to control it too strictly, but to feel it lengthen on its own, in and out, like a tide moving under ice you cannot see. We're going to step away from the bright, busy surface of the world for a while, away from screens and skylines and the noise of the day, and drift outward together over colder, deeper water where almost nothing announces itself. Follow me as we leave the coastlines behind, those ribbons of lights and roads and harbors that we often picture when we think of the ocean. One by one, the ports fall away, the last fishing boats turn back, and the glow of cities on the horizon shrinks to a faint band, then to nothing. Above us, the sky becomes a darker dome. Beneath us, the sea turns from familiar green to a slow, heavy blue that thickens with depth. Now picture what happens as we stop thinking of the ocean as a flat surface and begin to move downward, through the layers that sunlight can barely touch. The blue dims, the temperature drops, and the pressure rises, every few meters adding another invisible weight, until the world around us is not air and light, but water and darkness, and the quiet creak of metal holding back the deep. Somewhere below, the seafloor waits, a cold, uneven plain where almost no one goes. But we're not only traveling in depth, we're also sinking back through years, letting the present peel away above us like layers of sediment. Past the 2000s, past the 1980s, past the first images of the whole Earth seen from space, until we settle in the 1960s, when it briefly seemed obvious that if we could put people in orbit, we could also plant them beneath the waves. Underwater colonies were drawn up on paper with the same confidence as moon bases. In that moment, the deep sea looked like a frontier that might finally be conquered. Flags were literally pressed into the seafloor near projects like Sea B and Conshelf, while aquanauts lived in metal cylinders under many atmospheres of pressure. Like early astronauts turned sideways and sent into water instead of vacuum. NASA and navies watched closely, timing how long people could endure the cold, the confinement, the strange acoustics of a world with no true surface. And yet, for all that ambition, many of those rooms were later emptied without ceremony, their hatches sealed, their names fading from public memory. We'll arrive there soon, at the quiet moments when the lights were switched off and the sea began to reclaim them, and we'll ask why almost no one talked about it. Why a dream that seemed so solid could vanish so completely into the dark beneath us. The myth of the empty deep. What we think lies below. We often picture the deep ocean as a kind of blank dream, a single endless shade of blue that just keeps going down until it dissolves into black, with a smooth, sandy bottom somewhere far beneath us that almost nothing ever touches. Maybe, if we let our imagination wander a little, we add a lonely shipwreck, a scattering of bones, a submarine gliding past in the cold, self-contained and untouched by time. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, because that picture, while soothing in its simplicity, leaves almost everything out. The real seafloor, especially in the places where we're going, is not an empty canvas at all. It is crossed by cables that carry voices and data between continents, dotted with sensor arrays listening to the earth and the sea, and marked by test structures and frames that once held cameras, drills, or small metal rooms where people tried to live under constant pressure for days or weeks at a time. Now, picture what happens when we take that stereotype of a vast, untouched abyss and quietly lay an industrial park across it, then turn off the lights and walk away. In some regions, that is very close to the truth. Off the coast of California, beneath water that surfers skim across every day, engineers lowered experimental habitats to the seafloor, then left their anchors, platforms, and scars behind when the projects ended. In the Mediterranean, under shipping lanes and tourist ferries, saturation stations once rested on flat patches of sediment, their curved walls holding back the deep. Near Caribbean islands, in water that looks clear and harmless from the surface, training modules and research pods sat on coral sand, humming softly while aquanauts slept inside. We're going to move through that hidden layer of the world where the ocean floor becomes a quiet archive of human plans. Some of the structures we'll meet were full saturation habitats, where crews stayed under high pressure for so long that returning to the surface took days of careful decompression. Others were compact experimental living modules, just big enough for a few bunks and a table, built to see whether a small group could share a metal cylinder without losing their sense of time. There were training stations for divers, temporary laboratories bolted to the bottom, and hybrid systems that blurred the line between a ship and a house. Some of these have been removed, cut free, or lifted back into the air. Some were dismantled in pieces so that no trace would remain. But others are still there, sitting quietly in the dark, their paint peeling, their hatches sealed, their names long since dropped from reports and newsreels, while fish and invertebrates explore the edges where metal meets sand. From above, almost none of this is visible. A beach looks like a beach. A calm blue bay looks like a calm blue bay. There is nothing on the surface to suggest that, years ago, people slept, worked, and dreamed in small rooms far beneath those waves, listening to the creak of metal and the soft hiss of air systems, trusting thin walls to hold back the sea. That is the barrier we live with. A world that seems simple from the surface, and another world, just a few dozen meters down, that remembers ambitions we have almost forgotten. To understand why those rooms were abandoned, we first have to see that they were there at all, not just forgotten, quietly erased. The core problem: those rooms were there, and yet, in a strange way, they were never really allowed to exist in our shared memory. We often picture great projects ending with speeches, with cameras, with a careful placing of artifacts behind glass so that no one forgets. Under the sea, it was different. When the doors finally closed on many of these habitats, there were no crowds, no long goodbyes, just a quiet line in a report and the sound of pumps winding down. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and follow me in your mind, not to a museum, but to a cold, dim place beneath the surface where there is no gift shop, no plaque, no preserved control room. CLAB, Conshelf, Tektite, names that once stood at the front of press conferences, were often retired with only a brief notice or none at all, and then scattered into storage yards, training sites, or the deep itself. Some pieces were hauled away, others were left where they sat on the seafloor, slowly slipping out of sight. Now, picture what happens to metal and paint and rubber seals when the ocean is given years, even just a few decades. Salt water works patiently at every bolt, every weld, every cable, the way ice works slowly on a mountain, reshaping it grain by grain. Corrosion eats through steel, coatings peel, small leaks become large ones, and fine sediment drifting down through the water settles into corners, then over floors, then over entire frames until outlines blur. Windows cloud, hatches jam. The clean geometry of a habitat softens and sinks into the background. Marine life joins in, without intention and without hurry. Sponges colonize sharp edges, corals and algae spread across panels, barnacles and tube worms grow in thick clusters, and fish learn that these strange shapes are simply part of their hidden world. A round viewport that once looked out into the deep becomes a dark circle behind a curtain of growth. From a distance, you might not see a station at all, only a patch of seafloor that seems a little more textured than the rest. Maintaining a pressurized habitat in that environment is unforgiving. At even modest depth, the pressure outside is many times what we feel on land, and every small flaw is amplified. Life support systems must run without interruption. Structures must resist not just weight but corrosion, fatigue, and storms far above. As long as funding is flowing and people are watching, that burden can be carried. But when money tightens, when political attention shifts, when robots promise cheaper data without the risk of keeping humans beneath the waves, the balance changes. It becomes safer and far less expensive to abandon, to dismantle, or to sink the remains than to preserve a fragile outpost in the dark. The sea does not argue, it does not mourn, it simply reclaims. Patient and indifferent, it takes back each bolt and panel, each cable and ladder rung, softening bright paint into rust, turning sharp corners into reefs, hiding the outlines of our ambitions under layers of sediment and life. With every passing year, it becomes harder to locate what once stood there, harder to prove that people lived in those rooms at all. So we find ourselves with a quiet tension. We dreamed of colonizing the seafloor, spoke of underwater cities, built prototypes that held back the weight of the earth itself, and then we let them be taken back almost without a word. Why did we walk away so softly? Why were these habitats not preserved like polar bases or spacecraft? Why were they allowed to fade until even their coordinates grew uncertain? To answer that, we have to step back from the metal and the sediment and look at the forces and far beneath it that shaped those choices and what they were hiding. To understand the end, we need the dream reframing the story. To understand why those metal rooms were left in the dark, we first have to understand what they really were and what we hoped they might become. We often picture them as the first streets of some underwater city, a kind of Atlantis built with steel instead of stone, waiting patiently beneath the waves for us to return. But if we slow our thoughts and look closely, the story is quieter, more technical, and in some ways even more human. Follow me, not down into myth, but into the very practical world of saturation diving. A saturation habitat is at its core a pressurized shelter where people live for days or weeks so they can work longer in the deep without climbing a long ladder of decompression every single time. Instead of rising and falling between the surface and the sea floor, their bodies stay adapted to the cold, heavy pressure of that hidden place, and they only pay the decompression cost once, at the end. It is an elegant solution to a very stubborn problem. Now, picture what happens when we compare the dream to the hardware. Not glass domes glowing like lanterns on the seafloor, but cylindrical pressure vessels, thick-walled and cramped, more like small industrial submarines bolted to the bottom than any kind of home. Inside, there were bunks stacked close, valves and gauges crowding the walls, air that always smelled faintly of metal and recycled breath. Outside, there was no garden, no street, only a narrow work area carved out of the dark, and then the endless deep. Yet for a brief span of years, these modest structures carried enormous expectations. During the Cold War, projects like CLAB, Conshelf, and Tektite were not just scientific curiosities. They were symbols, quiet declarations that a nation could master not only the sky and the ice, but the deep world beneath the sea as well. Naval planners imagined divers working on cables and sensors along the sea floor. Scientists imagined laboratories placed gently on continental slopes, and some visionaries truly believed the ocean floor might be humanity's next frontier, another surface of the Earth to inhabit, not just to visit. Those overlapping motivations gave the habitats their sudden momentum. Military budgets provided the steel and life support. National prestige provided the urgency, and a kind of experimental bravado provided the willingness to put human beings under such relentless pressure for so long. But the same forces that lit them up also made them fragile. When priorities shifted, when quieter technologies like remote vehicles promised similar results, without risking lives, the justification for keeping people down there began to thin. So these stations were never really abandoned cities, because they were never cities at all. They were tools, prototypes, stepping stones laid on the sea floor. And tools, unlike settlements, are easy to set aside when a newer one appears. The question as we move deeper into this story is why that newer tool was almost always a machine, and what we lost when we chose robots over rooms filled with human breath in the cold, dark water. Layer by layer, how a deep-sea habitat has to survive. So if those rooms on the seafloor were tools, not cities, we're going to need to understand just how fragile those tools really were. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and imagine that we peel one of these habitats open, layer by layer, while it still sits in the cold, dark water beneath the waves. We often picture the ocean as empty blue space, but to an engineer it is weight. At just 30 meters down, the pressure is already several times what we feel at the surface. At deeper research depths, it climbs until every square centimeter of metal feels as if it's holding up a small car, and every wall is carrying the load of buildings stacked on top of one another. Remember the gentle heaviness you feel at the bottom of a deep swimming pool, that muffled squeeze in your ears. Now picture what happens when that feeling is multiplied again and again, wrapped around you from every direction, for weeks. To survive that, the habitat has to become a kind of artificial shell, a man-made glacier of steel holding back a liquid world. Designers chose thick steel or specialized alloys, bent into spheres or long cylinders, not because they looked futuristic, but because those shapes spread the stress more evenly, letting the metal flow very slightly around the invisible fingers of pressure. Inside that shell, another world had to be built. Air systems to keep oxygen steady, cables bringing power from the surface, quiet machinery to keep the temperature from drifting toward the surrounding cold. But the sea does not just push, it also patiently unbuilds. Salt water is like a slow, invisible sandpaper, a chemical grit that is always trying to turn worked metal back into the scattered minerals it came from. Over months and years, tiny currents carry oxygen and salt into every scratch and weld, and corrosion blooms in hidden corners, beneath paint, inside bolts, under protective coatings that seemed perfect on land. Nothing dramatic at first, just a faint stain, a roughened edge, a handrail that feels a little less smooth. Inside, life support is its own delicate balancing act. Carbon dioxide from each human breath has to be scrubbed away before it builds up. Humidity has to be held in a narrow band so the air does not become a dripping, clammy fog. Filters have to catch trace contaminants that, in the tight air of a closed place, can slowly reach troubling levels. Under that much pressure, a small leak in a pipe, a failing pump, or a stuck valve can escalate quickly, not because the machines are weak, but because there is so little room for error. All of these layers, structure, life support, power, demand constant attention, constant measurement, constant money. As long as people are there to watch the gauges, to listen for new rattles in the walls, the safety margin holds. But the moment that vigilance begins to slip, whether from budget cuts or shifting priorities, the habitat starts to move from research station toward relic. In the next part of our story, we'll follow that slide and watch how, once the people leave, the sea quietly begins to take its rooms back. The first experiments, Cousteau's conch-shell villages, so when those lights go out and the gauges fall silent, it can feel as if the story ends there, with empty rooms in the dark. But to understand how we reached that quiet, we need to go back to a time when the seafloor was being imagined as a new kind of neighborhood, and when one French explorer was willing to turn that imagination into steel and glass. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and follow me to the early 1960s, when Jacques Cousteau and his team were lowering their first conch-shell habitats through the calm skin of the Mediterranean. We often picture that decade in terms of rockets and launch pads, but beneath the surface of the water, another experiment was unfolding, slower and closer to the cold, shifting light on the seafloor. Now, picture what happens as a small metal house, no bigger than a modest living room, settles onto its stilts in the sand. Conch-shell. I was simple, almost modest in its ambition. A steel cylinder perched just off the seabed, with rounded ends and a single door that opened straight into the water. From inside, aquanauts could look out through a porthole into a green-blue world, where particles drifted like slow snow, and the pressure outside was several times what we feel on land. To leave for work, they did not climb into cars. They stepped into diving gear, ducked through that wet doorway, and walked out across the bottom as if leaving a front porch. A year later, in the warmer Red Sea, Conshelf 2 grew that dream into something closer to a village. There were connected modules, a kind of underwater hamlet, with a central house, a workshop, even a tiny hangar for a diving saucer. Inside, the air was dry but tinged with metal and salt. Pumps hummed in the walls, and the constant awareness of the deep water just beyond the hull never quite left the back of anyone's mind. Outside the portholes, fish passed at all hours, like neighbors who never slept. We're going to linger there for a moment, in those cramped galley spaces, where meals were eaten at narrow tables bolted to the floor so nothing could drift, even though gravity still held. Imagine trying to sleep in a narrow bunk while the sound of compressors thrummed like a distant heartbeat, and the knowledge that several atmospheres of cold water pressed against the thin shell around you. Some aquanauts described a strange calm, waking at night and seeing, instead of a street lamp, the pale flicker of a curious fish hovering just beyond the glass. Beneath the romance, though, Cousteau's goals were practical and quietly radical: to test whether humans could live and work underwater for days and then weeks, to see if such villages might one day support industry on the continental shelf or host long-term scientific observation of this hidden part of Earth. Could we treat the seafloor the way we treat a polar research station or even a space station, and simply stay? The answer, at least for a while, seemed to be yes. The aquanauts completed their missions, gathered data, returned to the surface through careful decompression that respected the slow physics of gases in blood and bone. Then the habitats were lifted, towed away, or dismantled. They were always meant to be temporary, proof-of-concept rooms, rather than permanent homes. And that pattern of building something bold beneath the waves, inhabiting it just long enough to prove that we could, and then quietly removing it before the sea had time to erase it, would echo again and again around the world. Because if these first bright steel villages could not stay, what hope did the deeper, darker stations that followed really have? A sudden surface, pausing with a different ocean. So before we go further down, let's do something a little unexpected together. For a moment, we're going to leave the seafloor entirely and lift our minds up and away from the cold, dark water, to another metal habitat suspended in another kind of hostile world. Imagine the International Space Station drifting far above the Earth's surface, a bright, angular shape against the black. We often picture it as a distant lantern, but in many ways it is simply another sealed set of rooms, another pressurized bubble where people sleep, work, and wait, surrounded not by water and sediment, but by vacuum and radiation and endless night. Make yourself comfortable with that image for a second. Solar panels outstretched like frozen wings, thin walls holding in air and warmth, computers humming softly, while, just a few centimeters away, the pressure drops to almost nothing. Inside, there are handrails instead of floors, experiment racks instead of portholes, but the logic is the same as any undersea station. Keep the atmosphere stable, keep the temperature livable, keep the hidden dangers on the other side of the wall. Now, picture what happens if something fails. On the seafloor, water forces itself inward with crushing pressure. In orbit, the air inside tries to rush outward into space. Different directions, different materials, the same fragile compromise. Both kinds of habitat demand constant maintenance, careful monitoring, and teams of people who accept that they are, for a while, very far from help. There is isolation in both places, and a kind of deep quiet. Crews on the ISS circle the world every 90 minutes, watching continents slide past beneath shifting veils of cloud and ice. Aquanauts once looked out through small round windows and saw only rock, sand, and the slow drift of silt. Each station was, in its time, held up as a symbol of a new era, proof that we could live where humans were never meant to stay. But the way we treat these two frontiers could hardly be more different. The ISS is photographed constantly, visited by astronauts from many nations, streamed in high definition as experiments unfold in real time. Its budgets are debated in public, its extensions announced with ceremony, its sunsets and auroras shared around the world. Undersea habitats, by contrast, were often dismantled quietly or simply left beneath the waves with no cameras watching, their stories fading as the metal dimmed. Why did one extreme outpost become iconic while the other slipped into obscurity? Not because one is more difficult than the other, but because our attention, our funding, and our imagination chose the sky. Follow me as we gently set the ISS back in its orbit. Let that comparison hover at the edge of our thoughts and turn once more toward the deep. Because to understand what happened to Seal AB and why its bright promise ended so abruptly, we need to carry both images at once, a shining station above and a darkened one below. CAAB, the Navy's underwater frontier. So now we have those two images in mind, one bright and busy above the Earth, one dim and quiet beneath the surface, and we can make ourselves comfortable inside the darker one for a while. Because before the dream of undersea cities faded, it crystallized very briefly into something real called Seal AB. In the mid-1960s, when Cold War anxieties flowed like a cold current through politics and science, the US Navy lowered steel habitats onto the seafloor and asked people to live inside them for weeks. Seal AB-I rested off Bermuda, Seal AB-2 off California, each at roughly 58 to 62 meters deep, where the pressure was about 6 times what we feel at the surface, and where a diver could no longer simply swim back up without careful, patient decompression. We often picture the ocean as empty blue space, but here it became a kind of submerged outpost, humming quietly under the weight of water. Inside, the reality was both ordinary and strange. Imagine a metal cylinder with cramped bunks stacked like shelves, a tiny galley, walls lined with control panels and valves, cables leading to the surface like umbilical cords. The aquanauts moved in slow arcs, sharing air thick with humidity and the faint smell of oil and metal, listening always to the gentle hiss of gas and the distant crackle of a voice from the support ship above. This was a room that knew it was deep, every seam and gasket holding back the sea, every gauge a reminder of the pressure pressing from all sides. Their days followed a careful rhythm. Long working dives outside, made possible by saturation living, meant they could stay under pressure for days and weeks, instead of wasting hours on repeated descents and ascents. They repaired equipment, ran experiments, practiced construction on the seafloor, all under a ceiling of cold water. At night they wrote logs, talked quietly, tried to slow their thoughts enough to sleep, while pumps and fans whispered around them. Now picture what happens to a mind when the horizon is a metal wall an arm's length away, day after day. For the Navy, this was never just a curiosity. It was a strategic experiment in an era when submarines, undersea cables, and hidden listening posts felt as consequential as rockets. Could divers stay down long enough to rescue trapped submariners, to build and maintain structures on the seafloor, to carry out delicate intelligence work in a world where the deep ocean itself had become part of the battlefield? Not because they loved the romance of the sea, but because they were quietly mapping a new domain of warfare. NASA watched closely. These habitats became analogues of space missions, sealed test chambers where human psychology, teamwork, and endurance could be measured under isolation and confinement. How does a small crew handle conflict when there is no easy escape, when every breath depends on a fragile system, when the outside world is not empty space but something just as unforgiving? Follow me here. The same questions that haunted early space capsules were echoing softly beneath the waves. For a moment, it worked. Seal AB-I proved that people could live and work at depth for weeks. Seal AB-2 pushed further, with longer stays and more complex tasks, a kind of rehearsal for permanent seafloor bases that planners sketched with quiet confidence. It felt, to those involved, as if we were standing at the edge of a new underwater world, one that might one day rival the stations in orbit. But just as the vision sharpened, a shadow lengthened. To see why the dream did not simply continue, we have to descend one step further, to CLAB3, where the same steel, the same pressure, and the same ambition met a night on the seafloor that did not end the way anyone expected. CLAB3 and the moment everything changed. CLAB3 was supposed to be the moment the dream solidified, the point where underwater living stopped being an experiment and started to look like infrastructure. We were going to take a familiar steel shell, refurbish it, and lower it much deeper, to a cold, black slope off California, almost 185 meters down, where the pressure was nearly 20 times what we feel here at the surface. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine that descent. The habitat, hanging beneath a barge, easing through layers of water that grow steadily darker and colder until the world above becomes only a memory and the seafloor appears as a faint, grainy outline in the lights. It was still Earth, still our own ocean, but it may as well have been another planet. The plan sounded straightforward on paper. Place CAAB3 on the bottom, send teams of saturation divers down in stages, and have them live and work there for days at a time, repairing, testing, pushing the limits of what human bodies and machines could endure beneath that much pressure. Yet even before anyone settled inside, the sea began to answer back. There were leaks in the habitat's seals, valves that did not behave as expected in the cold, and lines that twisted or kinked under shifting loads. Each small problem demanded a complex underwater repair. Each repair added time, cost, and strain. Communications crackled, schedules slipped. The whole operation, already intricate, became a kind of three-dimensional puzzle in the dark, with people's lives depending on every connection, every bolt, every reading on a distant gauge. We often picture the ocean floor as a quiet, still place, but for the crew, it felt tense, alive and unforgiving. During one of those repair dives, when a team was sent down to fix persistent leaks and secure the habitat, a diver did not come back alive. The details, examined later in long, careful investigations, involved equipment issues, procedures under revision, and the immense, invisible hand of pressure that magnified every mistake. There was no need for dramatic language. The loss itself was stark enough. In the months that followed, the Navy slowed its thoughts, reviewed recordings, interviewed witnesses, and tried to understand exactly what had happened. What emerged was a sobering realization. At that depth, with that complexity, the margin for error was vanishingly thin. A combination of cost, danger, and changing military priorities towards satellites, submarines, and eventually robotic vehicles made it harder and harder to justify returning to that slope in the cold Pacific. Quietly, CLAB3 was halted, not with a grand announcement, but with a gradual turning away as budgets moved elsewhere and plans for deeper habitats were folded into archives. Now, picture what happens when a dream is not shattered loudly, but allowed to sink slowly into the dark. This was one of the first moments when the vision of cities beneath the waves began to dim, even if most people on land never heard its name. Because somewhere beyond CLAB3, in the same deep water, other stations would follow, and they too would learn how the sea remembers every risk we take with it, and how it quietly takes some of those risks back. Living under pressure, the invisible strain on the human body. Down there, in those quiet metal rooms the sea has started to reclaim, the real experiment was never just about steel and valves, but about bodies and minds learning to live under a different kind of gravity. We often picture these habitats as tiny submarines parked on the bottom, but the truth is softer and stranger than that. They were more like borrowed pieces of another world, where even your own blood answered to the water's weight above. Follow me for a moment into that hidden, pressurized space. Make yourself comfortable, and imagine that instead of diving for an hour and then returning to the surface, you and your crewmates simply stay beneath, day after day, until your bodies are saturated with the breathing gases around you. That is what saturation diving means. At a certain depth, your tissues absorb as much dissolved gas as they can hold, and from that point on, staying longer doesn't make decompression slower. It just makes your stay deeper in time. Now, picture what happens when it is finally time to come home. You cannot just open a hatch and swim up, the way we might idly imagine from a film. If you did, the gas dissolved in your blood and joints would rush out of solution, forming bubbles, the way a shaken bottle of soda fizzes when the cap comes off too fast. So instead, the habitat, or a small pressurized chamber, becomes a slow elevator back toward the surface, its pressure reduced in tiny steps over many hours, sometimes over several days, while the sea waits just outside. Inside, the changes are subtle but constant. The gas mixtures used to make breathing safe at depth often include helium, and under that mix, voices rise into thin, almost comical tones, so that serious scientific conversations can sound like they're happening in a cartoon. Sleep can fray at the edges as pumps hum, lights cycle, and the body's sense of day and night slips away in the cold, artificial glow. Joints feel the strain of repeated compression and decompression over years. And in the background, there is always the quiet vigilance for decompression sickness, for a strange ache or dizziness that might mean the pressure has written itself into the body in a dangerous way. Psychologically, too, the sea presses in. These habitats were not large. They were closer to a small camper than a city beneath the waves, and crews had to be chosen and trained with great care. Isolation, confinement, the knowledge that just a few centimeters of metal stood between warm air and a deep cold place at 10 or more atmospheres of pressure, all of that could magnify minor tensions into something sharper, not because aquanauts were fragile, but because the environment itself was relentless. Every extra day underwater brought more samples, more observations, more data about this other world on our own Earth. But it also brought more exposure to risk, more complex decompressions, and more cost in medical support and specialized training. That balance between what we could learn and what we were asking human bodies to endure would slowly begin to tilt, and in the next part of our journey, we're going to see how machines quietly stepped in where people once lived on the seafloor. Tektite and the quiet pioneers of the Caribbean. Machines did step in, and they still do, but for a little while longer, people and metal and seawater were sharing the same quiet rooms. To see that clearly, we have to leave the cold, dim North Atlantic and let our minds drift to a warmer place, where the water is bright instead of black, and the seafloor feels almost close enough to touch from the surface. Make yourself comfortable and follow me to the late 1960s to a small bay in the US Virgin Islands where another experiment in living beneath the sea was unfolding. Here, instead of stormy grey waves and icy currents, there were gentle swells, clear tropical water, and a slope of coral that dropped away into deeper blue. Somewhere just offshore, not far in terms of depth, but very far in terms of experience, lay Tektite I, and later Tektite II. We often picture undersea bases as dark, labyrinthine complexes, but Tektite was almost modest. White cylindrical modules, like oversized storage tanks laid carefully on the bottom, connected by short passages and surrounded by sand, coral heads and slow-moving fish. Inside, the layout was compact but carefully planned, with bunks stacked along curved walls, a small galley, workspaces crowded with instruments, and a wet porch where divers emerged dripping from the sea, carrying samples and cameras instead of treasure. Imagine standing at one of those round viewports, the metal around you humming softly under the steady pressure of the water, and looking out into a world of reef fish, wavering shafts of sunlight, and the occasional curious turtle passing by. This was not the crushing depth of the abyss, but it was still a place where humans could not survive unprotected for long. A shallow yet demanding frontier where days and weeks at saturation blurred together into one long dive. Tektite's missions stretched that time deliberately. Crews stayed down for weeks, sometimes more than a month, turning the habitat into a laboratory for both marine science and human behavior. Researchers mapped coral communities, watched how reef life changed from day to night, and tested how people coped with confinement, constant humidity, and the knowledge that the only way home involved a slow, carefully staged ascent. During Tektite 2, all female aquanaut teams lived and worked there, conducting serious research at a time when the idea of women leading such missions still felt quietly radical. For a few years, this little cluster of white cylinders was a node where oceanography, psychology, and even spaceflight analog studies met, as NASA and the US Navy watched closely to see how people performed in an isolated, pressurized world. Then, almost as quickly as it had arrived, it was over. Funding shifted, priorities moved upward into orbit, and the habitat was dismantled, lifted piece by piece back through the surface, leaving only disturbed sand and slowly recovering coral behind. Now picture what happens on those same beaches today. Tourists walk along the shore, children play in the shallows, divers fin past the reef edge, and the water looks as untouched as any other clear tropical bay. How many of them know that, for a brief span of years, people were living on the bottom just offshore, drinking coffee, writing notes, listening to pumps and fans in the night? How many can feel the faint echo of that experiment when they float above the same slope of rock and sand? Because even here, in water that feels friendly and familiar, we can see a pattern beginning to form. Habitats appear, knowledge accumulates, and then the structures vanish, their stories sinking into archives while the sea quietly heals over the scars. And in the next part of our journey, we're going to follow that pattern into deeper, darker places, where the stations did not leave quite so cleanly, and where the ocean has been slower to let them go. A pause in the descent, listening to the ocean's silence. So before we follow those stations into deeper water, let's pause for a moment and let the scene grow quiet around us. If you'd like, make yourself comfortable, and if it feels safe to do so, you can even close your eyes while we slow your thoughts and visit one of these places as it is now. Imagine we're sinking gently, not in a rush, just drifting down through a column of cold blue that darkens slowly, the bright surface thinning above us until it becomes a distant, trembling ceiling of light. The pressure builds around us, steady and invisible, and the colors drain away, leaving a world of soft grays and deep, velvety blues, where shapes only appear when they are already close. The seafloor arrives almost shyly, not a dramatic cliff, not a glowing city, but a flat, muted plain of fine sediment, stirred now and then by a passing current. And there, half buried, is what we've come to see: a low, rounded structure, a metal shell slumped gently into the mud, its edges blurred by sponges, corals and thin films of life that have taken the hard lines and softened them with patience and years. We often picture the deep as silent, but if we listen here, there is sound everywhere. Far off, like memory carried through stone, a whale's call bends through the water, rising and falling in slow phrases. Closer in, the constant crackle of tiny shrimp and other hidden creatures makes a kind of underwater static, a soft restless hiss against the hull. From very far above, filtered through kilometers of water, comes the faint, almost ghostly hum of ships crossing the Earth's surface, a reminder that human traffic still passes overhead, even if no one comes down. Inside, though, there are no human voices now. Once, these rooms held the busy, experimental atmosphere of the 1960s missions: clipboards and checklists, bubbles of exhaled air, the clink of tools, the low murmur of people testing how long we could live beneath the sea. Now, Picture what happens when all of that stops. The ocean does not rush in dramatically. It simply settles, like a blanket being laid over a sleeping house, muffling edges, dimming echoes, letting stillness accumulate. Somewhere, in a few scattered places, those metal rooms are likely still intact, sealed pockets on the seafloor. In one, perhaps the air remains, stale and unmoving, pressed against rusting walls. In another, a slow leak long ago invited the water inside, and it stands now as a flooded corridor where fish drift through doorways and control panels sit furred with corrosion, their labels pale and unreadable. What experiments were written on those panels? Who last turned those switches, and did they imagine anyone would ever see them again? We're going to stay here, just for a breath or two longer, in this quiet, because this is the core mood of their story. Not conquest, not constant activity, but a long reflective silence where human time and ocean time slide past each other. In the next part, we'll lift that blanket a little and visit the stations where the sea has not yet finished its work, and where our presence still lingers in sharper, more troubling ways. Why we left. Money risk and changing priorities. So now, as we sit with that long, reflective silence, make yourself comfortable again, because we're going to lift our eyes just a little above the silt and look at the forces far away on the surface. That decided how long those quiet rooms could exist. The story of why we left the seafloor does not begin in the deep. It begins in offices, in budgets, and in a very different kind of cold. In the 1960s, when CLAB and Conshelf and Tektite were first lowered into the dark, the world above was locked in Cold War tension, and money flowed toward anything that promised an edge. We often picture that era in rockets and satellites, but there was also a quieter race beneath the waves, where living on the seafloor hinted at new military listening posts, new mining frontiers, even underwater outposts like a submerged space station. As long as that fear and competition held, the numbers, for a time, made sense. Now, picture what happens when that urgency softens. Each mission needed a support ship on the surface, humming day and night, with crews of divers, engineers, doctors, and technicians. Fuel, food, spare parts, decompression chambers, medical evacuation plans, constant communications checks. The invisible scaffolding around a single small habitat could stretch for kilometers and for years. To keep just a few people beneath the water, an entire floating village had to stand ready above, and every extra day underwater meant more cost, more pressure on the ledger as well as on the hull. Then there was the other kind of pressure, the one you feel whenever a human life is balanced against an experiment. When CLAB-3 suffered its fatal accident, the loss was not only personal and profound, it also echoed in committees and review boards. Was the science or the strategic gain worth even the chance of repeating that night? On paper, a saturation habitat promised unique data and training. In the quiet of a hearing room, a single death could outweigh 100 optimistic reports. Risk did not vanish, but it became harder to sign for. Over the next years, something subtler shifted. As remotely operated vehicles and autonomous instruments improved, the question changed from "how can we live down there?" to "why should we?" We could visit the same cold, hidden places with cameras and robotic arms, staying safely on a ship or on land, touching the deep world without keeping human bodies under continuous, crushing pressure. Not a glorious retreat, but a gentle redirection. So there was rarely a dramatic last day. No countdown, no final broadcast. A mission ended, and the next one simply wasn't scheduled. A habitat was towed to shore and stored, or quietly scrapped, or left where it sat, while the sea began its slow reclamation. In the next part, follow me a little farther, and we'll visit what remains of those decisions on the seafloor itself, where the budgets have long dissolved, but the metal has not yet completely disappeared. Legal grey waters, ownership, liability, and the seafloor. So, as those missions ended and the cameras turned away, something quieter remained. Far beneath the waves, the question of what exactly we had left sitting on the seafloor, and who, if anyone, still owned it. Before we visit those rusting rooms directly, we're going to slow your thoughts for a moment and step back to the invisible lines humans have drawn across the ocean. We often picture the sea as one endless blue sheet, a single cold world wrapping around the Earth. But legally, it is sliced into zones, each with its own rules about what can rest on the bottom. Close to shore are national waters, where a country can decide who drills, who fishes, who builds. Farther out, beyond those borders, the seabed slips into international space, a kind of shared, almost abstract territory, where no state is supposed to claim the deep crust itself, but where they can still lay cables, tow mining tests, or anchor temporary habitats. Now picture what happens when you lower a pressurized steel cylinder, full of people and equipment, into that layered legal ocean. An undersea habitat like CLAB off the United States or Conshelf in the Mediterranean was built by specific agencies, funded by specific governments, and yet once it touched the seafloor, it raised strangely simple questions with surprisingly tangled answers. Who truly owned that structure after 10 or 20 years of corrosion? Who carried the responsibility if its hull failed, if trapped fuel leaked, if a curious diver was injured while exploring it long after the program's end? Because the pressure down there is not only physical, it is legal and it is ethical. A habitat abandoned in shallow coastal water might fall under clear national law, but one in deeper, more ambiguous zones drifted into what some officials quietly called grey waters, where liability could spread uncomfortably between navies, research agencies, and sometimes private contractors who no longer even existed. At the same time, a different kind of responsibility was taking shape in our thinking. Imagine the slow release of rust, paint, trapped gases, or old hydraulic fluids into a hidden valley of the seafloor, where cold currents move lazily and delicate animals have grown for years in the dark. Early projects rarely considered long-term contamination, but by the late 20th century, scientists were more cautious, worried that corroding alloys, batteries, or chemical canisters might quietly poison a place designed to be a window into the ocean, not a source of harm. In that light, keeping a dead habitat on the bottom meant accepting a long, open-ended duty. Inspections, possible cleanups, paperwork that could last far longer than the brief, bright era of aquanauts. For some stations, it became simpler and cheaper to raise them back through the water column, cut them apart on land, and let the seafloor return to its own slow rhythms, rather than maintain legal and environmental guardianship over a rusting shell no one visited. So many were towed away at night or lifted in unremarkable daytime operations that never made the news, that it began to feel, from the surface, as if the dream of living under the ocean had simply melted like seasonal ice. Yet not everything was removed, and not every decision was so clean. In the next part, follow me down to the places where those choices were less tidy, where metal still lies half claimed by law and almost fully claimed by the sea, and where the story of abandonment is written directly into the sand. Rusting rooms in the dark, what was left behind. So now, follow me a little farther down, away from the clean diagrams and the tidy press releases, into the cold places, where the story didn't end with a crane lifting the last module away, but with a quieter decision to simply stop going back. We often picture these habitats being neatly erased from the seafloor, as if the Earth itself had been restored to some untouched state. In reality, the endings were mixed. Some stations, especially the shallow prototypes near busy coasts, were fully recovered, their metal shells hauled up through the water column, inspected, and eventually cut apart on land. Others were only partly dismantled, their fragile living compartments removed, while the heaviest pieces stayed put, because the cost, the risk, and the sheer pressure of the deep made retrieval more trouble than it seemed worth. A steel foundation ring here, a cluster of anchor blocks there, a tangle of pipes and umbilicals buried in sand that no one bothered to dig out. Now, picture what happens to the metal that remains. At first, the paint flakes and peels in slow motion, lifting away under the constant scouring of silt and salt. Bolts that once gleamed under inspection lights begin to fuzz with corrosion, threads swelling and locking so tight that doors seize in their frames and hatches become suggestions rather than moving parts. Over years, the bright colors chosen to be visible from the surface fade into a uniform muted skin, streaked with rust and the pale ghosts of old logos. Make yourself comfortable for a moment inside one of those rooms. The pressure outside has long since found every weakness. Seals have failed. Windows have crazed and cracked. Water has come in, not as a single dramatic breach, but as a slow, persistent invasion until the boundary between inside and outside dissolved. Silt settles on control panels and old NASA-style checklists, turning switches into small hills and dials into half-buried moons. Straps float, then sag. A coffee mug, a dropped wrench, a laminated emergency procedure drifted, then came to rest in a thin, shifting layer of mud. Fish move through these spaces now as if exploring a cave beneath a glacier of water rather than ice, weaving in and out of doorways that once framed human faces. Sponges bloom where wiring once ran along the ceiling. Crabs patrol along the curve of old pressure hulls, using the same pathways that aquanauts followed in soft-soled boots. Over time, the sharp geometry of engineering blurs into something more like a reef, a hidden world that belongs less to us and more to whatever can cling and grow. Even where the main habitat has been removed, the seafloor remembers. Heavy bases still press into the sediment. Chains and anchors lie half-buried, their outlines softened but not erased, creating small artificial cliffs and ledges where currents slow and larvae settle. To a passing remotely operated vehicle, these might look like random scrap, until you trace the pattern and realize they once held up a small, self-contained world. We're going to return to the living people who built and left these places, but for now, let your thoughts slow on one last question. How many such sites are still out there, unmarked on public maps, known only to a few specialists? A handful of local divers, and the animals that sleep in their rusting rooms in the dark, measuring from above how we study the deep without living there. So we leave those rusting rooms in the dark for a moment, and we rise, slowly, back toward the surface. Not all the way to air and light, but to the thin layer where cables hum, signals pass, and machines do the work that people once did face to face with the seafloor. Make yourself comfortable and follow me, because we're going to look at how we study this deep world now, from just a little farther away. Instead of aquanauts waking up inside the ocean, we guide remotely operated vehicles from warm control rooms, drive autonomous underwater vehicles through black water on pre-programmed paths, and let sonar paint the hidden shapes of canyons and ridges we may never see with our own eyes. We often picture exploration as a person standing on a new shore, but here it is, more like listening through a wall. ROVs sink far beneath the waves, trailing umbilical cables that carry power and video, their metal frames shrugging off pressures that would crush a human chest in an instant. AUVs glide without tethers, quiet and self-contained, following maps that exist only as coordinates and timing, turning back toward the ship when their batteries fade, like migrating animals returning to a nest. Now picture what happens when these machines arrive in that cold, heavy place. Cameras begin to stream pale cones of light into the dark. Sonar pulses ripple out and come back as ghostly outlines of rocks, shipwrecks, even abandoned habitats half buried in sediment. Sensors sip the water, measuring temperature, salinity, oxygen. Tiny traces of chemicals that tell us where vents leak heat from the deep earth or where a plume of disturbed mud has drifted, over years, track by track. These data build up into detailed maps, seafloor observatories wired by cables to shore, long lines of instruments listening for earthquakes, counting passing fish, recording the slow breathing of tides and currents. It is precise, persistent, astonishingly rich, and yet it is still indirect. We do not feel the pressure in our ears. We do not smell the faint metallic tang near a vent, or notice with the corner of a tired eye the way one particular crab returns to the same rock every evening. Life inside a habitat was different. People woke up already beneath the sea, checked gauges before coffee, watched the daily rhythms of marine life the way we watch weather from a window. Experiments could sit on a table for weeks, adjusted by hand, visited at odd hours when someone couldn't sleep. The seafloor was not a distant screen. It was a room away, a door you could open. Now most of our doors are digital. We can map more of the ocean floor than ever before, trace every contour under the ice and every slope beneath a distant glacier. But the era of humans actually dwelling there has almost closed. We traded presence for reach, intimacy for coverage, and somewhere in that trade is a quiet question. What changes when the sea forgets the feeling of us living inside it and remembers us only as passing lights on its ceiling? Because the people who made that trade were not abstract committees. They were specific engineers, divers, and officials, facing costs, accidents, and fears they rarely spoke about in public. And their choices still shape what we dare to build under the water now. Why robots won. The quiet triumph of uncrewed exploration. So, if the sea slowly forgot us as tenants, we have to ask another question. Who, or what, moved in instead? If you slow your thoughts for a moment and listen past the memory of human voices, you can almost hear the answer humming in the dark. We often picture exploration as a person in a suit, a face behind glass, a fragile body pressed by enormous pressure, but the deep world beneath the surface quietly chose a different companion. Follow me down, not into a metal room with bunks and coffee cups, but into the beam of a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV dangling from a ship like a cautious lantern, or an autonomous underwater vehicle, an AUV, swimming on its own through cold black water. These machines do not breathe, they do not sleep, they do not need food, warmth, or a safe place to dream between shifts. Now, picture what happens when we remove the limits of the human body. There is no need for life support systems that must never fail, no need for long decompression in a chamber after weeks at depth, no narrow band of safe pressures and gases that must be maintained for years if we insist on living down there. An ROV can touch depths where the pressure would crush a habitat like thin ice under a heavy boot. An AUV can slip beneath Antarctic ice shelves or along trenches far beyond the reach of any diver, then return quietly with its memory full of the seafloor. At first, these robots were expensive curiosities, complicated and moody in their own way, but something important shifted. A habitat is married to one cold place, welded to the bottom, its costs ticking upward every hour. Power, maintenance, corrosion, staffing, emergency readiness. A single serious leak, and the whole world inside is at risk. A vehicle, by contrast, can be lifted back to the surface, repaired, upgraded, and sent to a new ocean entirely. The same system can serve dozens of expeditions, across years, without anyone ever needing to sleep under 10 atmospheres of pressure. There is another, quieter comfort in all this. When we send machines instead of people, the ethical and legal weight lightens. Fewer lives hang on a valve or a bolt. Insurance contracts become simpler. Nations can send uncrewed vehicles into international waters with less fear of an accident turning into a crisis. The deep sea remains dangerous, but the danger is now mostly to metal and electronics, not to lungs and hearts. And as cameras sharpened, as fiber optic cables carried live video to warm, brightly lit control rooms, As tiny sensors tasted chemistry and sound and current with exquisite precision, the scientific argument for putting people on the seafloor began to thin out. The romantic pull stayed. The data did not strictly need us anymore. There was no single morning when someone announced that the age of undersea stations was over. Instead, funding drifted toward ships and robots, one proposal at a time, one quiet budget meeting after another, until, almost without noticing, we found that most of the habitats were dark, their work taken over by unblinking eyes that never asked to come home. But if the robots won, does that mean the story of living beneath the water is finished? Or just resting, waiting for a different kind of dream? Aquarius, the last big habitat still holding on. So, if most of the lights went out, what managed to stay on? Follow me for a moment from those silent, rusting rooms to a small, still-living outpost, resting not in some far polar abyss, but just off the warm coast of Florida, where the water is clear and blue at the surface and quietly cold and green beneath. Make yourself comfortable as we slow our thoughts and sink down together. About 20 meters under the waves, on a patch of sand beside a coral reef in the Florida Keys, there is a shape that looks a little like a small, yellowish submarine that forgot how to move. This is Aquarius Reef Base, the last major undersea research station still in operation. Bolted to the seafloor on steel legs, its rounded hull streaked with years of salt and growth, humming softly against the gentle pressure of the surrounding sea. Inside, the world becomes narrow but strangely complete. We often picture laboratories as bright, open rooms, but here the ceilings are low, the air is thick with the faint smell of metal and ocean, and every square meter has a purpose. Scientists and sometimes astronauts in training sleep in stacked bunks, listening to the constant murmur of pumps. They share a tiny galley, write notes at cramped desks, and glance up at wall gauges that quietly report the pressure, the oxygen, the status of the life support that keeps this deep hidden place alive. At one end is the wet porch, a room where the floor is not really a floor at all, but an open pool of seawater. Now picture what happens when someone steps down into it. There is no dramatic splash, just a slow crossing of a shimmering boundary where air becomes water and a diver passes from the habitat into the reef as easily as walking out a front door. That simple doorway is what makes Aquarius different from a ship or a robot. It turns the ocean itself into the hallway outside. For years, Aquarius has lived with its own kind of uncertainty. Funding has ebbed and flowed like the tides above it, with more than one announcement that the station would close, be mothballed, or be left to the coral and the rust. Each time, a mix of scientific value, training importance, and public fascination has pulled it back from the edge. Why keep this one habitat alive when so many others were allowed to fade? Part of the answer lies in space. NASA uses Aquarius as a space analog, a place where crews can rehearse long-duration missions and practice extravehicular activity in a world that is controlled, but never entirely safe. Underwater, suits are heavy, movements are slow, communication can be delayed or confused, and the awareness that a mistake means more than just getting wet settles into every decision. It is not orbit, and it is not a glacier on some distant moon, but it is close enough to teach. In that sense, Aquarius is a contrast and a mirror. It shows us what it looks like when a habitat does not simply vanish into the dark, when the years of experience are not just archived in reports, but continue as a living routine of waking, working, and sleeping beneath the sea. And at the same time, its solitary presence reminds us how much was lost when the others were abandoned or dismantled. How thin the line now is between having a human home on the seafloor and having none at all. Because if one small yellow station can survive on the sand of a Florida reef, we have to ask, what would it take to build something like this again, in colder, deeper, more demanding waters? And why have we hesitated for so long? The stations we don't talk about, hidden and classified sites. So when we look at that one bright yellow habitat still glowing in shallow, friendly water, we also have to remember that not every station was meant to be seen, or photographed, or visited by school groups on summer trips. Some were never designed to become symbols of exploration at all. They were tools, tucked quietly beneath the surface, built to serve other kinds of missions. We often picture undersea habitats as open scientific playgrounds, cousins of space stations, where cameras followed aquanauts and magazines ran glossy spreads. But alongside Conshelf and Tektite, there were structures whose stories never quite reached the light. Follow me for a moment into that colder, more private world, where the same steel rooms and thick viewports sheltered divers training for submarine rescue, or technicians testing industrial valves and drilling systems under relentless pressure, far from curious eyes. During the Cold War, when the ice of geopolitics felt especially hard and brittle, naval programs experimented with saturation habitats that were less about oceanography and more about learning how long a person could safely work at depth, how a crew might repair a submarine hull, how equipment behaved when the sea pressed against it day after day. Some of those chambers were anchored just off busy coasts beneath shipping lanes and tourist beaches, and yet almost no one on land knew they were there. They were never meant to be destinations, only means to an end. Because of that, the paper trail around them is thin. Reports were stamped, filed, or lost. Corporate test sites passed from one company to another. Diagrams were treated as proprietary blueprints rather than public records. Now, picture what happens as years go by. Engineers retire, offices move, archives are boxed and forgotten in some cold storage room, and the coordinates of a small steel cylinder on the seafloor quietly slip out of human memory. The structure remains, but the story unravels. We're going to consider something slightly unsettling. It is entirely possible that beneath us there are still intact or half-collapsed stations resting in the dark, known only to a narrow circle of operators, local divers, or former crew members who remember them the way you might remember an old workplace. They are absent from documentaries, missing from children's books about the ocean, and yet they are as real as any celebrated habitat in the history of undersea research. For historians and oceanographers trying to reconstruct a full map of human life on the seafloor, this secrecy becomes its own kind of obstacle, a soft but impenetrable layer, almost like a man-made glacier of missing information. Not because anyone is actively hiding a grand conspiracy, but because classification, corporate caution, and simple neglect have frozen many details in place. The result is a patchwork record, scattered and incomplete, where we can trace some bright lines and only guess at the rest. So when we ask how many stations were truly abandoned, how many were quietly decommissioned, how many still sit under cold water and heavy pressure, the honest answer is that our numbers may be lower than reality. There may be more rooms, more corridors, more rusting doors on the deep seafloor than we can currently verify. And if that's true, then we have to wonder, what else is lying down there, uncounted, just beyond the edge of the maps we trust the most? Human minds in metal shells, the psychology of seafloor living. So if there are still unknown rooms beneath the waves, quietly rusting in the dark, we should also remember that for a while, those rooms were full of people, human breath, human voices, human minds trying to stay steady in a very strange place. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine stepping through the hatch of one of those habitats. Inside, the sea's vastness collapses into a narrow cylinder or a low metal box. The outside world is cold, black, and silent. But in here there is a constant mechanical hum. Fans and pumps and scrubbers working to keep you alive. A soft vibration that never quite stops, even when you close your eyes and slow your thoughts for sleep. We often picture the ocean as endless space, but life on the seafloor was the opposite. Bunk beds pressed close together, cables along the ceiling, a small table bolted to the floor, the same few faces, only an arm's length away for days or weeks. The air is always slightly used, slightly recycled, smelling faintly of metal, plastic, and people. And just beyond a thin wall of steel or fiberglass, the water waits with crushing pressure, 10 or more times what we feel at the surface. A reminder that this is not our natural world, not really. To live like that, even for a short mission, aquanauts learned to build little islands of normality. They followed strict routines, not just for safety, but for sanity. Wake at the same time, check gauges, log readings, run experiments. They shared meals at that tiny table, celebrating small things like a favorite dessert or a new story from home. They scheduled calls with the surface, hearing voices filtered through radios and cables, and they invented rituals, movie nights, quiet reading hours, a last cup of coffee before lights dimmed, to convince their minds that this metal shell beneath the sea was, for now, a kind of home. Many of them later described an almost spiritual awe, looking out of a small window at a hidden world of fish and drifting particles, knowing they were among the very few humans to live so deep for so many years of our species' history. But awe does not erase confinement, long-term isolation, the lack of privacy, the awareness that a simple failure could turn this refuge into a trap, all pressed inward slowly and invisibly. Because as missions stretched from days into weeks, psychological and interpersonal dynamics stopped being background noise and became central engineering constraints of their own. Who gets irritable when tired? Who needs silence? Who takes charge in a crisis? And who withdraws? These questions could decide whether a mission felt like a calm scientific retreat or a pressure cooker. And planners had to choose and support crews with the same care they used for hull thickness and life support systems. Now, picture what happens when all of this meets budgets and risk calculations back on land. We're going to weigh the cost of intricate habitats, the difficulty of maintenance under constant pressure, and the quiet strain on the people inside, against newer tools, remotely operated vehicles, autonomous robots that never get lonely and never argue over the last clean towel. Not because the dream of seafloor communities was foolish, but because, over time, the combination of technical limits, financial realities, and the delicate architecture of the human mind made permanent cities on the deep seafloor feel less like the next step for Earth, and more like a beautiful idea we weren't quite built to inhabit. And yet, the story doesn't end with the doors closing and the lights going out. In the next part, we'll follow those robots that replaced the aquanauts and ask what we gained and what we quietly lost when we chose metal eyes over human ones in the deep. From dream to niche. How undersea habitats shrunk in scope. We often picture the story of exploration as a series of bold beginnings and dramatic endings, flags planted and then torn down. But this, one slipped away more quietly, like a light dimming in a room no one was watching. If you make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, we're going to walk back to the years when the ocean floor was imagined as humanity's next great address. In the 1960s, glossy magazines and soft-spoken science shows invited people to imagine a different world beneath the waves. Underwater hotels, with picture windows opening onto forests of coral, farms laid out in orderly rows on the seafloor, even entire communities sealed under domes, like frozen bubbles on the dark ocean surface. It felt almost natural to think that, if we could live in space, then of course we would live under the sea, as if the deep were just another neighborhood waiting for electricity and mail delivery. Now, picture what happens when that dream meets pressure, salt, and time. The grand cities became smaller diagrams, then modest metal cylinders with names like Seal AB, Conshelf, and Tektite, where a handful of aquanauts could stay for weeks, learning how bodies cope with long exposure to cold water, high pressure, and the strange isolation of a place that is close to Earth yet profoundly alien. These were no longer prototypes for underwater suburbs. They were framed as laboratories, training grounds, and support bases for offshore work. even that narrower future kept shrinking. Industrial planners realized that, instead of keeping people saturated at depth for years, they could send down remotely operated vehicles, tethered robots with cameras for eyes, and metal claws for hands that never needed to decompress or sleep. Offshore drillers discovered that dynamic positioning ships could hover over the deep, staying in place with computers and thrusters, without building permanent structures on the seafloor at all. For long-term monitoring, quiet observatories were bolted to the bottom, instruments listening in the dark, sending their data upward through cables, with no bunks, no kitchen, no air to breathe. Here's the pattern interrupt. We learned how to be more present in the deep by not being there. The habitats did not explode or fail in some dramatic way. They were simply outcompeted by tools that could endure the cold and the years more cheaply and safely than a human crew. Today, only a few undersea habitats remain, like Aquarius Reef Base in the warm shallows off Florida, used for specialized research and astronaut training rather than as a blueprint for cities on the abyssal plain. They are rare, carefully maintained islands of air beneath the water, visited occasionally, then left alone as the sea presses gently against their walls. Not a collapse, but a quiet narrowing of ambition, so gradual that many people never noticed it happening at all. And as those rooms emptied and the seafloor returned to darkness, something else took their place in our imagination. In the next section, follow me down to meet the machines that stayed when we left and ask what kind of world they reveal when no one inside is watching. Echoes in space. What seafloor stations taught astronauts? But even after those machines settled in and the last human footsteps faded from their metal floors, the story of undersea stations didn't really end there. It just moved somewhere you might not expect. Upward. Because while the seafloor went quiet, another kind of habitat was taking shape above the atmosphere, and the people planning it were listening very closely to what the ocean had already taught. We often picture space stations as something entirely separate from the sea, gleaming islands of technology floating in a pure black sky. But in practice, agencies like NASA and their partners treated the deep as a rehearsal hall, a cold, heavy-pressured echo of orbit where they could make mistakes more safely. If you make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, you can almost overlay the two, a cylinder on the seafloor, a cylinder in orbit, both fragile pockets of air surrounded by a world that will not forgive a leak. In projects like CLAB and Tektite, aquanauts lived for weeks at a time in saturation. Their bodies adjusted to the pressure, their movements confined to a tiny interior volume, and carefully planned excursions outside. To space planners, this looked very familiar. Underwater spacewalks became a way to practice extravehicular activity, with divers in bulky gear moving slowly along the habitat hull, rehearsing how to carry tools, tether themselves, and solve small problems before they became large ones. The sea was not vacuum, but it was close enough in spirit to reveal how easily a glove could snag, how quickly a checklist could fray under stress. Inside those steel rooms beneath the surface, teams also experimented with something that seemed simple until you need it to work for months: talking. Engineers imposed artificial delays, strict communication protocols, and quiet periods, mimicking what it would feel like when a crew in orbit or on another world could not just call home instantly whenever they wished. They drilled emergency procedures in that dim, humming light, practicing fires, floods, and medical surprises, learning how people actually behave when there is no quick ladder back to the open air. Over years, the data that flowed up from these hidden places shaped the way we now live off Earth. Lessons from CLAB and Aquarius slipped into the design of life support systems that recycle air and water, into schedules that rotate crews before isolation becomes corrosive, into psychological support strategies that acknowledge how important a small window, a private corner, or a regular call can be. Not in dramatic headline-grabbing ways, but in quiet checkboxes and revised guidelines, the kind that keep a station alive year after year. There is an irony here, gentle but sharp if we sit with it. The public image of seafloor habitats rusted away, yet pieces of their influence now circle above us, orbit after orbit, as if some part of those abandoned rooms had floated up through the water and lodged in the design of the International Space Station and its successors. The shells rest in the deep, under cold layers of water and the slow settling of silt, but their ideas travel overhead, invisible and constant. So when we look up at night and see a moving point of light, we are also, in a way, looking down, back toward every cramped chamber that proved humans could share a small, isolated volume for weeks without breaking. But what happens when we reverse the direction again and bring the logic of space back to the sea, building new stations that treat the ocean itself as an alien world? In the next section, follow me, because that is where the story starts to bend in a surprising direction. The ocean as an unyielding partner, why it's harder than orbit. So as we bring that logic of space back down into the water, make yourself comfortable for a moment, because there is a quiet assumption we all tend to carry with us without really noticing it. We often picture orbit as the final extreme, the hardest possible place to keep a human alive, and the seafloor as something gentler, just a cold room a bit farther down from the surface of the Earth. It feels intuitive, doesn't it? Space is far away, black and airless, while the ocean is right here, wrapping the planet, a familiar blue that we swim in and sail across. If we can keep people circling the Earth for years inside the International Space Station, surely we can manage a few hundred meters beneath the waves. But now, picture what happens when we actually compare the two environments, not in terms of distance, but in terms of pressure, predictability, and the way they press back on our fragile machines. Space, for all its emptiness, is simple in one very specific way. Once you leave the atmosphere, the pressure outside your spacecraft is essentially zero, and it stays that way whether you drift a few kilometers higher or lower. The vacuum does not pile up on you. It does not double and triple with every small change in altitude. Underwater, by contrast, pressure climbs quickly, 1 atmosphere added for every 10 meters you descend, so that a habitat at 100 meters sits under a crushing weight that never relaxes, every bolt and weld carrying the full mass of the ocean above. Follow me a little deeper. In orbit, you fight radiation and temperature swings, but you do it against a vacuum that cannot carry sound, that cannot seep into cracks. In the sea, water is everywhere, flowing into every weakness, conducting heat away from warm human rooms with ruthless efficiency, carrying sound and vibration through metal walls so that pumps, compressors, and even distant ships become a constant background presence inside. Noise that would die out in air can travel for long distances in this dense, cold world beneath the surface, turning a small habitat into a resonant shell that hums and shivers. And the ocean is not just water and pressure. It is chemistry and life and slow-moving stone. Steel that might sit quietly in orbit for decades begins to rust, pit, and flake in salty brine. Paint blisters, seals stiffen, and tiny leaks grow. Biofouling coats every exposed surface with films of microbes, barnacles, and corals, adding drag to cables and strain to structures. Sediment stirred by storms or currents creeps and settles, burying pipes, scouring foundations, and sometimes undermining the very legs that keep a habitat level on the seafloor. So when we look back at those early deep-sea research stations, at the small metal rooms abandoned in the dark, we start to see that the ocean was never a softer rehearsal for space. Not a gentler version of orbit, but a different, equally demanding partner, one that changed and corroded and grew around our constructions, quietly pushing back against our dreams of permanent homes on its floor. In the next part, we're going to see how that resistance, combined with politics and money, slowly turned our attention away from living down there and towards sending machines in our place instead. Ethics in the abyss, disturbing the seafloor to study it, because that resistance wasn't only mechanical and financial, It was also ethical, and it grew slowly, almost invisibly, around those steel rooms on the seabed, the way a thin film of life grows on a rock left in the tide for years. As we kept putting habitats on the ocean floor, we began to realize that we weren't just visiting a neutral stage. We were rearranging a hidden world to make space for ourselves. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and follow me down to one of those early stations, something like CLAB or Conshelf, resting in the cold, dim water beneath the surface. To hold it in place, engineers drove anchors into the seafloor, sometimes into coral frameworks that had taken centuries to grow, or onto soft sediments, where worms, brittle stars, and tiny crustaceans lived in complex, fragile communities. Now picture what happens when a metal cylinder settles there. It casts a permanent shadow, redirects currents, muffles some sounds and adds others, and turns a once-open place into a maze of beams and cables. We often picture the seafloor as empty, just sand and silence, but even a small habitat changes that quiet pattern. Its lights spill into the dark, confusing animals that use faint glows and bioluminescence to communicate. Pumps and generators add a constant hum to a soundscape once shaped by distant storms and the low crackle of life. The pressure is the same, the water is just as deep, but the arrangement of who can live where and how is suddenly different. In the 1960s and 70s, when many of these projects began, there was far less formal oversight of what we did to the ocean. There were few environmental impact assessments, fewer international rules, and almost no public conversations about disturbing deep habitats that most people would never see. Not because people were uncaring, but because the science of these ecosystems was still in its infancy, and the law hadn't yet caught up with what we were capable of building. Over the following decades, as marine biology advanced and treaties multiplied, that changed. We started to understand that even low-oxygen basins and polar slopes, places that seemed barren, were in fact dense with slow-growing corals, sponges and microbial mats that might take hundreds of years to recover from a single scrape. So the idea of leaving a retired station on the bottom, with its cables, sharp edges, and sealed compartments, began to feel less like harmless clutter and more like a long-term experiment we hadn't really designed. There were worries about leaks from old fuel lines or batteries, about paints and coatings slowly flaking away, and about the way these structures acted as artificial reefs, attracting fish and invertebrates that would never normally gather there. Was that a gift or a distortion? Were we creating new oases of life, or pulling predators and competitors into sensitive areas that had evolved under a different, quieter set of rules? And as our picture of deep ecosystems sharpened, the dream of permanent human outposts in those places became more complicated. It was no longer just a question of whether we could keep people alive under that much pressure, but whether we should impose our architecture on regions that might hold climate records, rare species, or entire communities adapted to absolute darkness. The same ethical caution that slowed drilling into subglacial lakes under ice and glacier systems began to seep into conversations about the sea as well. So when budgets tightened and political enthusiasm faded, a subtle shift had already begun. We were going to keep exploring, but we were also going to slow our thoughts, step back a little, and let robots take the risks instead of building new steel villages on the bottom. Remotely operated and autonomous vehicles could touch down briefly, then leave almost no trace, giving us data without anchors, without constant light, without long shadows. Because somewhere below the last abandoned habitat is a stretch of seafloor that has never felt the weight of our machines at all. And the next part of this story asks a quieter, harder question. What do we owe to that untouched place? And what happens when we finally decide whether to disturb it again? Future echoes. Could we ever return to living on the seafloor? So, if the last question was about what we owe the untouched seafloor, the next one is quieter still. Could we ever go back to living down there? And if we did, could we do it differently? For a moment, Make yourself comfortable and let your thoughts drift down through the water, past the light, into that hidden place where the old habitats are slowly dissolving into rust and coral. We often picture those Cold War stations as fragile metal bubbles, always one leak away from disaster, and in many ways they were, their walls slowly losing the long fight against salt and pressure. Now, picture what happens if we start again with different tools, alloys and ceramics that shrug off corrosion for decades instead of years, transparent composites that do not cloud or crack, flexible skins that bend gently rather than snap when a current tugs at them. The seafloor stops being a graveyard of abandoned shells and becomes a world of objects designed to arrive, to work, and then to leave almost no trace. We're going to need better life support too, not just bigger tanks. Imagine compact systems that quietly recycle every breath, every drop of water, drawing energy from slow temperature differences in the deep or from quiet fuel cells instead of noisy generators, so that a small team could stay beneath the surface for weeks without a constant resupply parade from above. Modular habitats could be sawed in sections, linked like building blocks, and then lifted away again, cleaned and repaired in the air, rather than left behind to decay. Why would we bother when robots already roam where humans once lived? One answer is oversight. As deep-sea mining moves from idea to proposal, some nations and scientists argue that we may need human eyes on the seabed, not to dig, but to watch the digging, to listen for the subtle sounds of cracking rock and collapsing communities that sensors alone might miss. Another is patience. Long-term climate and ecosystem observatories resting in the cold dark for years, recording the slow breathing of the ocean, could occasionally welcome crews who come down to recalibrate instruments, to notice what the graphs do not show. And then there is tourism, that persistent human urge to turn every extreme into a hotel. It is not hard to imagine a handful of deep, carefully regulated refuges, more like small monasteries than resorts, where visitors spend a night under hundreds of meters of water, hearing the distant groan of ice and ship hulls far above, and leave with a sharper sense of how thin their usual world is. In many designs on drawing boards today, the main residents are not people at all, but machines. Autonomous observatories that sit on the seafloor for 10 or 20 years, powered by slow chemical reactions in sediments or by cables from shore, already exist in shallow forms. The emerging idea is to make them semi-permanent and semi-human, robotic sentinels that work alone for months, then host a short human mission that arrives like a visiting tide, checks their health, upgrades their senses, and retreats. Here is the pattern interrupt. To understand where undersea living might go next, we have to look away from the ocean entirely, because somewhere else in our solar system, beneath the ice of Europa or Enceladus, we imagine dark oceans under far greater cold and pressure than any earthly trench. Astrobiologists sketch out missions where a heated probe melts through a glacier of alien ice, releases a swimmer into the black water, and perhaps, one distant day, anchors a tiny habitat to the rocky seafloor of another world. Those designs, in turn, loop back to Earth. If we learn to build habitats that can endure in a place with no air, no easy light and an ice ceiling kilometers thick, then an updated seafloor station at a few hundred meters begins to look almost gentle by comparison. Techniques for sterile drilling, for clean power in isolation, for living months in cramped, quiet rooms, all grow from the same root, whether the ocean is on our planet or under a distant moon. So, a return to widespread seafloor living, with underwater cities and highways of lights, seems unlikely, at least in the near future. Not because the dream has died, but because it has changed shape, stretching outward into space even as it leaves faint reflections in our own deep. The next human home on a seafloor may come not from the memory of CLAB or Conchalf, but from a machine first meant for Europa. And the real question waiting for us is not just whether we can build it, but what kind of presence we will choose to be when we finally knock on the door of the deep again. Mapping ghost stations, how we might find what's left. So if our next homes in the deep might be robotic, that leaves us with a quieter question. What about the homes we already left behind? Out there, beneath shipping lanes and sunlit tourist beaches, there are rusting metal rooms on the seafloor where people once lived, and then slipped out of the story. Tonight, we're going to think about how we might find them again. Make yourself comfortable and slow your thoughts for a moment, because the search would not begin with dramatic dives, but with patient patterns. We would start at the surface, in warm, well-lit archives, turning pages and scrolling through faded project names, CLAB, Conshelf, Tektite, and smaller test habitats, whose coordinates were sometimes classified, sometimes simply forgotten. Old logbooks, funding reports, even newspaper clippings would narrow the map to a few stretches of cold, quiet seafloor. From there, the modern tools take over. Research vessels already crisscross the oceans with sonar, sending fans of sound down into the dark, listening for the way it bounces off rock, sand, and steel. A habitat, even half buried beneath silt, reflects differently from the natural seabed, a small geometric echo in a world of soft contours. Local diver reports, half-remembered stories from fishermen or retired Navy crews, could point us toward these anomalies, turning vague circles on a chart into likely places where walls and hatches still wait under the pressure. Now, picture what happens when we finally choose one of those echoes and follow it. Instead of people, we lower a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV, into the deep. Its lights carve a narrow tunnel through the water, and the camera drifts forward, like an unblinking eye. Out of the darkness, the shape appears. A cylinder or a box, its paint peeled away, its metal skin furred with barnacles, sponges and coral, hatches crusted over like fossilized doors in a drowned city. We often picture exploration as planting flags or switching the lights back on. But here the goal would be different. This would be a kind of underwater archaeology, not to reclaim these rooms, but to witness what years of cold water and slow sediment have done. The ROV could glide past portholes clouded with algae, over cables sinking into the seabed, past tools left on exterior racks, each image a record of how the sea patiently edits our technology. Such documentation has its own quiet value. It preserves the history of undersea exploration, showing how we once tried to live beneath the surface of our own world, long before we sent cryobots toward icy moons. It helps biologists and environmental scientists see how artificial structures age, what grows on them, whether old fuel lines leak, how fish and invertebrates turn a human habitat into a reef. And it answers a softer curiosity, not the loud "what's down there" of conquest, but the gentler "what became of the places we once cared about." A small community already feels that pull. Some oceanographic institutes, museum teams, and independent enthusiasts quietly compile coordinates, ROV footage, and diver sketches, building informal catalogues of these ghost stations. It is still a niche within ocean science, overshadowed by more urgent missions, yet it persists, like a side current flowing beneath the main. Follow me for a moment into the near future, and imagine a ship that sails with no intention of drilling, mining, or building anything new. Its crew is there only to visit. They lower their ROVs, they drift above these abandoned habitats, and they watch in respectful silence as the cameras reveal rust, coral, and darkness, not to reactivate them, not to move back in, simply to say, in the only language the deep can hear, that we remember they are there. Somewhere beyond those quiet visits lies an even harder question. How long should anything we leave on the seafloor be allowed to remain at all? You and the abyss, why this forgotten story matters. Somewhere beyond those quiet visits lies an even harder question. How long should anything we leave on the seafloor be allowed to remain at all? And tucked inside that is something even more personal. What do these abandoned rooms, these small experiments in living with the ocean, say about us? Make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, because we're going to use these forgotten stations as a kind of mirror. We often picture human progress as a clean upward line, moving from first attempts to permanent colonies, from trial to triumph. But the story of undersea habitats is softer and stranger than that. A slow surge of ambition that rose, met the cold pressure of the deep, and then receded almost without a sound. Imagine the pattern hidden in those timelines. In the 1960s, governments talked seriously about underwater cities, about families living beneath the waves the way we now talk about bases on Mars. Engineers built saturation labs where aquanauts stayed under pressure for weeks, just as astronauts circled the Earth for months. Then funding thinned, rust thickened, and one by one the doors were sealed. Not with ceremony, with paperwork. Now, picture what happens when you stand on a cliff or a beach and look out. For most of us, the ocean is a flat surface, a moving sheet of water and light. But once you know that there are rusting corridors beneath shipping lanes, quiet laboratories under tourist boats, the sea stops being blank. It becomes layered in time, a place where experiments, risks, and quiet retreats lie stacked like sediment on the seafloor. That shift matters even if you never breathe from a helmet or touch a habitat hatch. The deep is not some distant world we can choose to ignore. Its currents move heat around the planet, shaping the climate that touches your window. Its fisheries feed cities you've never seen. Its myths and stories, from sea monsters to lost worlds, flow through our cultures like hidden rivers under a glacier of everyday life. What happens in that darkness comes back to the surface, to us, again and again. There is also a quiet value in remembering projects that did not become permanent. These habitats mark the boundaries of what we could hold against pressure, corrosion, and human strain. They remind us that the Earth is not simply waiting to be occupied, but is powerful in its own right, and that working with such a place requires humility as much as confidence. So next time you see the sea, follow me in this small exercise. Imagine, somewhere far out, a dim metal room that once glowed with instruments and quiet breathing, now wrapped in coral and cold. Let that image sit beside the waves in front of you. Because to understand what we try to build in the deep, we also have to ask what the deep is slowly building out of us. And that question leads somewhere even stranger. A last look through the porthole, re-anchoring in the hidden world. So make yourself comfortable again, and let that dim metal room come into sharper focus, as if we're slowly drifting down toward it through the cold. We're going to step inside, just for a moment, and borrow the view that a few people once had, in a place far beneath the surface, where daylight never really arrived. Imagine you're standing in the center of a small habitat, the air a little heavy, the hum of pumps and filters like a steady mechanical heartbeat. Around you, panels blink softly, notes are taped to metal walls, a mug floats just slightly in the dense, pressurized stillness. In front of you there's a round window, a single porthole into another world, and beyond it the seafloor stretches away, dark and simple and strangely calm. Tiny particles drift past, like slow snow in water that has forgotten what weather is. A curious fish pauses in the beam of a lamp, eye reflecting your own face back at you, then disappears into the deep blue-black. The sand looks untouched, the cables from the station lying neatly on it, as if the whole glacier of the ocean above had been frozen in place just for this experiment in living beneath it. For a while, this was home. Now, picture what happens when we let time keep going, and we quietly step away. The same porthole is still there, but the glass is clouded with a film of algae and pale sponges, ringed with rust that blooms outward like slow fire in reverse. Inside, the lights are gone, the air long since lost, the notes and mugs and instruments softened into shadows that no one reads under a pressure that never relaxes. Outside, the sea floor has shifted. Sediment has piled gently against the hull. Cables are half buried, half bitten by corrosion. Where the lamp once carved out a circle of clarity, there is only the faint green of distant plankton and the quiet visits of passing crabs. The station is still there, but it no longer remembers us, and the world around it does not remember that we tried to stay. We often picture these habitats as little cousins of space stations, and in a way they were. Saturation chambers like Sealay B or Tektite, tiny pressurized islands where engineering, physiology, and psychology were all being tested at once. Yet unlike the bright orbiting labs we celebrate, many of these rooms were simply sealed, logged as retired, and left to sink into anonymity. In the last little while together, we've walked through so many layers of that story. The metal and seals that fought the pressure, the bodies adapting to dense breathing gas, the politics and laws that decided where on the map a nation could bolt a lab to the seafloor, the ethics of disturbing a hidden landscape that had been quiet for thousands of years. And beneath all of that, the slow arithmetic of time in a place without seasons, where years pass as a steady accumulation of silt and shell. If some of those details have already blurred a bit, that's all right. This is not a world we memorize, it's a world we feel, like a slow current moving past our hands. What stays with us is that last look through the porthole, bright once, clouded now, and the sense that we lit small temporary stars on our own planet, and then let the dark, patient water take them back. In a moment, we'll surface a little and ask what these quiet, abandoned rooms might still be teaching us, even now. Surface slowly, gathering the threads of the journey. So now, as we begin to rise, we can feel how far we've come. We started with a simple, almost unsettling idea that beneath ordinary waves and shipping lanes and sunny beaches, there are, or were, metal rooms on the seafloor where people once ate, slept, worked, and dreamed. And yet those rooms have slipped out of the story most of us carry about the Earth. Follow me, just for a moment, back through those rooms as if we're moving slowly along the bottom before we turn upward. We visited Conshelf's experimental villages first, those early French habitats where aquanauts stepped out into the cold, pressurized water as if they were trying out a prototype for a new kind of life, half in our familiar world and half beneath it. Then we crossed to Sealay B, where the United States Navy folded military ambition and Cold War anxiety into steel cylinders, pushing people deeper, longer, until one tragic accident reminded everyone that at 10 atmospheres of pressure, small mistakes are not small at all. From there we drifted to Tektite, a quieter shape on the seafloor, where scientists and NASA looked at these stations and thought of space, using weeks underwater as a rehearsal for months in orbit, testing how minds and bodies cope when the surface is far away in more than just distance. And finally, we found Aquarius, still holding on in warm, clear water, the last large undersea lab of its kind, surviving funding scares and near closure while its predecessors rusted in the dark or were brought back up in pieces. Now picture what happens as we pull all of these places into a single, slow exhale. The pattern is almost painfully consistent. The cost of keeping human beings alive under that kind of pressure rose year after year as metal corroded, seals aged, and life support systems demanded constant care. The risks, to the divers, to the habitats, to the ecosystems just outside those hatches, never really went away, even when the equipment improved. Around them, laws about what we could leave on the seafloor and how we could disturb it grew more complex, especially once international waters and fragile marine reserves were involved. And while all of that was unfolding, something else happened. Robots got better. We're going to send remotely operated vehicles and autonomous instruments where we no longer send permanent human bases, not because we lost our curiosity, but because cameras and sensors can now slip into trenches and under ice, with a patience and a resilience that our bodies built for air and sunlight simply don't have. There is a quiet emotion that hangs over this history, like a faint current. We feel awe at what these aquanauts tried to do, melancholy at how many stations were simply switched off and forgotten, and a deep respect for the people who accepted the confinement, the isolation, and the unrelenting awareness of the water just outside the wall. In a way, this part of the story is its own decompression stop. Divers cannot rush to the surface without harm. They must pause, letting the invisible gases in their blood equalize with the changing pressure. In the same way, we slow our thoughts here, between those abandoned rooms and our ordinary lives, and we let the meaning of their rise and fall settle in. This is not a hard break with the deep, but a gentle ascent, one that carries a new understanding with it. Because when we finally surface, we won't just remember that there were once small houses on the seafloor. We'll be able to ask, with a little more clarity, what they were really for, what they changed, and what they still have to teach us about where humans belong in the hidden parts of our own planet. If you're still here, a soft thank you from the seafloor. So if you're still with us here, at this quiet edge of the story, that already tells us something about you. You followed a long, slow descent and an even slower return, and in a world that keeps asking you to scroll and swipe and move on, that kind of attention is rare, and it's something we don't take lightly. For us, this little channel is meant to be a kind of low, steady light in the dark, a small room of calm in a very loud house, where we're going to keep visiting the hidden corners of the planet that most people never think about. Sometimes that means the rusting shells of Cold War habitats on the seafloor, sometimes the labyrinth beneath a glacier, sometimes a forgotten observatory half buried in snow. But the feeling we're chasing is always the same. A slow, patient look at a world just beneath the surface of what we usually see. We often picture exploration as flags and headlines and triumphant music, but the kind of exploration we share here is quieter, more like sitting with a question for years and trying to conquer a place in a day. If that gentler pace has helped you slow your thoughts tonight, or simply given you something calm and deep to fall asleep to, then these hours of research and careful words have already done their work. If you'd like this small, quiet corner to keep existing, there are a few very simple things you can do, and none of them need to disturb the mood you're in now. A like, a subscription, or sharing this with one person who might also make themselves comfortable in this kind of cold, reflective space. Those are, in a way, the cables and airlines that keep a project like this alive beneath the pressure of the wider world. Not demands, just gentle ways of saying, yes, keep going, stay down here a little longer. As you drift towards sleep or turn back to the rest of your day, you might let a few of these images linger for a moment longer. Imagine those abandoned stations resting in the dark, their paint long since peeled away, sediment drifting through open doorways like slow snow, cables swaying almost imperceptibly in the deep. Now, picture what happens as the years pass. Metal softens, corners blur, and the sea, patient and unbothered, folds each structure back into itself, until it's just another quiet shape on the floor of the earth. We wish you rest, and we wish you curiosity both at once. There will always be more hidden places to visit together. Under ice, under oceans, and under the stories we think we already know, whenever you feel ready to follow me back down again. Optional drift, staying below a little longer. So for a little while longer, we're just going to stay down here together, in this quiet, in this deep, and let the story rest the way the stations themselves have rested. Folded into the seafloor and the dark. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are on the surface, and let your attention drift back to those small metal rooms on stilts, standing in the cold like watchtowers that forgot what they were watching for, their legs sunk into sediment, their windows looking out onto nothing but slow-moving black. We often picture the ocean as waves and sunlight and open blue, but beneath that, far below the last shimmer of day, there are still those cabins balanced above the sand, cables trailing away from them in long, patient lines, disappearing into a darkness that doesn't hurry and doesn't explain itself. Imagine you're there, not as a visitor with tasks and checklists, but as a quiet passenger, floating just outside one of those portholes, feeling the gentle pull and release of neutral buoyancy, neither rising nor sinking, just suspended between the roof of the earth above and the buried rock beneath. Around you, the only constant sound is the soft hiss and pop of bubbles, rising past your shoulders, brushing the underside of the habitat, then wandering upward into layers of water you can't see and won't follow, because here, for now, is enough. Inside, a single light is still on, a muted glow the color of late evening, turning metal walls into a kind of shelter against the endless black. And outside, that light spills in a small circle, just far enough to catch a few grains of sand, a corner of a ladder, the beginning of a cable that stretches away and then vanishes. Now, picture what happens when you let your eyes relax, when you stop trying to see every detail. The edges soften, the stilts become silhouettes, the cables become suggestions, and the whole structure feels less like a machine and more like a memory that the ocean is almost, but not quite, finished erasing. Every so often, something moves at the edge of that circle of light, a slow, drifting cloud of tiny creatures, a faint blue-green spark as a bioluminescent body turns over in the water, a scatter of points like a distant city seen through fog, here for a moment, and then gone. You don't need to name them, or remember them, or hold on to them. They pass through this hidden place the way thoughts pass through a tired mind, appearing, glowing briefly, dissolving back into the dark without leaving a mark. If you like, you can slow your thoughts to match that rhythm, letting each idea rise like a bubble, wobble, and then break gently against the ceiling of your attention, leaving only a small echo of sound that fades almost as soon as you notice it. There is nothing you need to understand here, nothing you need to keep track of. No dates, no depths, no designs, just the simple fact that for a few years, lights burned on the seafloor, and now, mostly, they do not. Follow me, just once more, along one of those cables, your hand gliding above it without touching, feeling the suggestion of its path as it disappears into thicker and thicker dark, until even the habitat behind you is only a dim suggestion, then nothing at all. In that place, without walls or stilts or instruments, there is only pressure, and cold, and the slow breathing of the water, and you, held in it as gently as air once held the people who slept inside those narrow bunks. And when you're ready, we can let even that go. Inside the empty habitat, a hand reaches for a switch. The last light lowers itself to a soft amber ember and then clicks off, and the ocean's darkness folds back in, patient and complete, as if it has been waiting years for this exact moment of quiet. From that quiet, from that seafloor, we'll say a soft goodnight and leave the stations where they are, hidden beneath the waves, while you rise or drift into sleep at whatever pace feels right, carrying only the faint outline of stilts, a cable, and a small circle of light that once kept the deep at bay. For the curious awake, we're to learn more, so as that last little circle of light fades and the sea folds back over it, we can, if we like, leave everything there, sealed away in the dark. Or, if a small part of you is still awake, still curious, we're going to open a very gentle door toward the world above the waves, where the story of these stations continues in quieter forms. Make yourself comfortable and slow your thoughts just enough to notice that almost everything we've talked about tonight has a paper trail, a film reel, a photograph somewhere. Projects like CLAB, Conshelf, Tektite, and Aquarius were once front-page news, and their traces are still scattered through documentaries, declassified reports, and books that patiently unpack the engineering, the politics, and the human moments of living for weeks under pressure. You don't need to memorize any titles. It's enough to know that if one day you type those names into a search bar, a small archive of this hidden world will quietly unfold. We often picture research as something hurried and competitive, But here it can be slow, almost like beachcombing along the edge of the ocean. Many national navies and space agencies have released old mission logs and technical summaries, sometimes with pages blacked out, sometimes surprisingly open, describing how aquanauts coped with the cold, the confined place, and the strange calm of the seafloor. Oceanographic institutions keep their own records too, and their digital archives can be wandered through at your own pace, like walking through a museum after hours when the lights are low and the halls are empty. If that sounds like too much, there is an even softer path. With nothing more than an online map, you can follow me down the coastlines, out over the continental shelf, and hover your view above the spots where habitats once rested on stilts. Satellite images, bathymetric maps that shade the seafloor into blues and purples, and occasional historical overlays can hint at cables, anchor marks, or small artificial shapes on the otherwise smooth surface of sand and mud. It becomes a quiet kind of digital exploration, a way of visiting a deep, cold place without leaving your chair, letting your mind supply the darkness and the muffled sound. And if none of that calls to you, that is completely fine. This does not need to turn into homework or a task waiting for you tomorrow. You are allowed to let the story end right here, with just a faint awareness that somewhere beneath the Earth's oceans there are metal rooms, long since flooded or sealed, where people once listened to the creaks of distant waves and then went home. Because even with all the films and files and maps, most of what happened down there will never be written down, and the deep will keep its own counsel. Now, picture what happens when we turn away from the known records and look instead toward the gaps between them, the places where the sea kept its secrets even while the cameras were rolling. A final surface, returning to your own room. So before we follow those gaps any farther, let's come back to where you are. For a moment, make yourself comfortable and notice the simple, quiet facts of your own little world. The way your chest rises and falls as you breathe, the way air moves in, cool, and slips out again, warm, without you ever needing to ask it to. Feel the bed or chair beneath you, the way it holds your weight so gently that you almost forget there is any pressure at all, compared to the crushing tons of water we've been visiting in imagination. Notice the fabric against your skin, the pillow under your head, the slight pull of gravity that keeps you anchored to the surface of the earth, instead of drifting in that slow, dark water beneath the waves. Listen, just for a second. Maybe there is the hum of a heater, a faint car passing outside, a refrigerator cycling on, or only the soft, familiar silence of a room at night. We often picture silence as empty, but your silence is full of known things, walls you have seen 1,000 times, objects you could reach out and touch even with your eyes closed. Now, picture what happens when we set that against the other place we've been holding in our minds. Down there, the silence is not warm and domestic, but cold and immense, broken only by the distant calls of whales, the hiss of sand shifting, the slow creak of a metal hull that has been sitting for years in the dark. The rooms are still there, but no one is reading in them. No one is making coffee. No one is laughing because a colleague told a bad joke over the intercom. It is the same idea of a room, but in a different world. A table, a bunk, a window, once filled with people measuring currents and listening to instruments, now watched only by fish and drifting snowfalls of marine snow. Above you may be a thin curtain or a ceiling lamp. Above them, hundreds of meters of water and ice. And above that, a restless, glittering surface they can no longer reach. And yet, if we let it, that knowledge can quietly widen the room you are in. Imagine the walls stretching outward in your mind until your ceiling is not just plaster or wood, but the night sky, and somewhere beyond that, an ocean, and beneath that ocean, those hidden stations waiting in the cold. We're going to leave them there, for now, but we know they are part of the same Earth that is holding you up at this very moment. Here is the small pattern interrupt. Nothing in your room has changed. The light is the same. The air is the same. The bed or chair is exactly as soft or as firm as it was when you pressed play. And yet, perhaps it feels a little different, because you are carrying a faint awareness of pressure and darkness and distance, of a deep seafloor that exists alongside your everyday life. If you like, slow your thoughts just a little, and breathe once more with that in mind. The deep does not ask anything of you. It simply continues, quietly, in the background of the world, while you move through your days on the surface. Those abandoned stations will keep rusting. The whale calls will keep wandering through the water, and somewhere, instruments will keep listening in the dark. Thank you for sharing this long, quiet dive with us, for letting your attention sink so far from the familiar lights of home and then rise back up again. As we close, we return fully to your own room, to your own life, leaving the seafloor behind us, but not erasing it. It is still there, waiting in the dark, part of the same planet, part of the same story, whenever you choose to remember it again. Until the next descent, a gentle promise. It is still there, waiting in the dark, part of the same planet, part of the same story, whenever you choose to remember it again. And just as those quiet rooms of metal and glass rest beneath the waves, there are other hidden worlds tucked into the cold corners of the earth, waiting in their own way as well. We often picture exploration as something loud and triumphant, all bright lights and countdowns, but the places we're going to visit together are mostly the opposite of that, slow and dim and patient, sealed under ice or stone, or decades of forgetting. Imagine the pale under-ice realms at the poles, where the sea glows a faint filtered blue beneath slabs of frozen ocean, and strange life hangs from the underside of the ice, like a forest turned upside down. Now, picture what happens when we drift even further from the surface, into deep caves, into flooded tunnels, into shafts that no one has walked through for years. Beneath old cities, there are labyrinths of lost infrastructure, flooded subway extensions, sealed bunkers, service corridors that end in blank concrete and rust, quiet in a way that feels almost oceanic. Above us, there are forgotten satellites still circling, cold and unvisited, small human-made habitats in the sky that echo those abandoned stations on the seafloor, all of them moving through darkness, still obeying the same gravity, the same slow laws of motion and decay. Each of these is its own little world, its own version of a laboratory left behind. This channel is our vessel for returning to those places, not in a rush, not to conquer them, but to sit with them for a while. When you make yourself comfortable here, you're stepping into a kind of shared cabin, where we can lower the lights, slow your thoughts, and follow one quiet thread of curiosity at a time. Not because we need constant novelty, but because the Earth is so much larger and stranger than what we see at the surface. From polar ice to deep caves, from drowned tunnels to retired machines orbiting far above, we're going to keep moving carefully at the same calm pace, always choosing clarity over spectacle, wonder over urgency, restfulness over noise. If you'd like to return for another long, quiet exploration, you're welcome to subscribe, or simply to find your way back, whenever the world feels a little too bright and fast. For now, the story of these deep-sea stations is complete, at least on our side of the water. Down below, the ocean goes on working in the dark, grain by grain, year by year, softening edges, thickening rust, folding each habitat back into the seafloor. While you sleep, the tides will still pass overhead, the pressure will still hold, the cold will still seep through metal and concrete, and those empty rooms will remain where they are, unseen but ongoing. So, we'll turn out the cabin lights here, and let the deep keep its vigil until our next descent.